Assalamu alaikum dear students. Today we are going to discuss nature of literature. Literature can be defined as an expression of human feelings, thoughts and ideas whose medium is language, oral and written. Literature is not only about human ideas, thoughts and feelings, but also about experiences of authors. Literature can be medium for human to communicate what they feel, think, experience to the readers. There are many ways to define the term literature based on different point of views, such as literature is art, literature is language, literature is aesthetic, literature is fictional, literature is expressive, and literature is affective. Literature is everything in print. It means any writing can be categorized as literature. Another way of defining literature is to limit it to great books which are notable for literary form or expression. Ellis defines literature as the verbal expression of human imagination and one of the primary means by which a culture transmits itself. Based on thus definitions, literature contains universal ideas, human imagination and human interest, what written in any writings, and use language as medium to express humans' ideas and feelings. In conjunction with literature as an art form, it is broken down into imaginative literature and non-imaginative. Imaginative literature and non-imaginative literature are distinguished based on the particular use made of language in literature. Language of imaginative literature is highly connotative, and language of non-imaginative literature is purely denotative. The connotative means word that is used in literary works have feeling and shades of meaning that words too tend to evoke, while denotative meaning means that the words refer to meaning in dictionary. The language that is used by literature differ from ordinary spoken or written language. Literature uses special words, structures and characteristics. Primarily, the language of literature differs from ordinary language in three ways. Now look at these three ways. Language is concentrated and meaningful. Number second is its purpose is not simply to explain, argue or make a point, but rather to give a sense of pleasure in the discovery of a new experience. Number third is it demands intense concentration from the readers. It indicates the language of literature has originality, quality, creativity and pleasure. In this case, to differentiate between the literary text and non-literary text, imaginative and non-imaginative, Cladden states that literature can be differentiated based on the kind of meanings that exist in a text. Literary text consists of textual meaning and referential meaning, and non-literary text only consist of referential meaning. The textual meaning is the meaning that is produced by the relationship of text itself, while referential meaning is meaning that is produced by the relationship between internal text and external text. Basically, two things are going to be discussed: internal and external text. From the use of language and existence of meaning in literary works, it can be concluded that poetry, prose, and drama are put in literary works. Article, journalism, news, bibliography, and so on can be categorized as in literary works. The nature and essence of literature. Now we'll see the things according to critics. Every interpretation of a text is always an authentication operation, so as hence Magnus argued it would require a more open and anarchic reading of that works. Carl William Bronze is saying about these things. Now T.S. Eliot says, what the dead had no speech for when living, they can tell you, being dead. The communication of the dead is tongued with far beyond the language of the living. William Faulkner says, the artist is of no importance, only what he creates is important, since there is nothing new to be said. Shakespeare, Balzac, Homer have all written about the same things, and if they had lived 1000 or 2000 years longer, the publishers would not have needed anyone since. Now look at this. What is literature? What is literature? Why do we read it? Why is literature important? Literature is a term used to describe written or spoken material. Broadly speaking, literature is used to describe anything from creative writing to more technical or scientific works. But the term is most commonly used to refer to works of the creative imagination, including works of poetry, drama, fiction, and non-fiction. Why do we read literature? Literature represents a language or a people, culture, and tradition. But literature is more important than just a historical or cultural artifact. Literature introduces us to new worlds of experience. We learn about books and literature. We enjoy the comedies and tragedies of poems, stories, and plays. And we may even grow and evolve through our literary journey with books. Ultimately, we may discover meaning in literature by looking at what the author says and how he or she says it. We may interpret the author's message. In academic circles, the decoding of the text is often carried out through the use of literary theory, using a methodological, sociological, psychological, historical, or other approach. These are the approaches. Whatever critical paradigm we use to discuss and analyze literature, there is still an artistic quality to the works. Literature is important to us because it speaks to us. It is universal and it affects us. Even when it is ugly, literature is beautiful. This is the thing, that even when it is ugly, literature is beautiful. The nature of literature. The first problem to confront us is obviously the subject matter of literary scholarship. What is literature? What is not literature? What is the nature of literature? Simple as such questions sounds, they are rarely answered clearly. One way is to define literature as everything in print. We then shall be able to study the medical profession in the 14th century, or planetary motion in the early Middle Ages, or witchcraft in Old and New England. As Edwin Greenlaw has argued, nothing related to the history of civilization is beyond our province. We are not limited to belles letters or even to printed or manuscript records in our effort to understand a period of civilization, and we must see our work in the light of its possible contribution to the history of culture. According to Greenlaw's theory, the practice of many scholars' literary study has thus become not merely closely related to the history of civilization, but indeed identical with it. Such study is literary only in the sense that is occupied with printed or written matter, necessarily the primary source of most history. It can, of course, be argued in defense of such a view that historians neglected these problems, that they are too much preoccupied with diplomatic, military, and economic history, and that thus the literary scholar is justified in invading and taking over a neighboring terrain. Doubtless, nobody should be forbidden to enter any area he likes, and doubtless, there is much to be said in favor of cultivating the history of civilization in broadest terms. As for the functions of literature, for the time being, just think to these two concepts: art for art's sake and art for progress. This is very interesting thing. Art for art's sake is the usual English rendering of a French slogan from the early 19th century, art pour art, and expresses a philosophy that intrinsic value of art. And the only true art is discovered from the didactic, moral, or utilitarian function. Such works are sometimes described as autotelic, from the Greek autotelic, complete in itself, a concept that has been expanded to embrace inner directed or self-motivated human beings. A Latin variant of this phrase, ars gratia arts, is used as a motto by Metro Goldwyn Mayer and appears in the circle around the roaring head of Leo the lion in its motion picture logo. L'art pour l'art, translated as art for art's sake, is credited to the Theophile, who was the first to adopt the phrase as a slogan. He was, however, the first to write those words. They appear in the work of Victor Cousin, Benjamin Constant, and Edgar Allan. For example, Poe argues in his essay, The Poetic Principle, that we have taken it into our heads that to write a poem simply for the poem's sake, and to acknowledge such to have been our design, would be to confess ourselves radically wanting in the true poetic dignity and force. But the simple fact is that would we but permit ourselves to look into our own souls, we should immediately there discover that under the sun there neither exists nor can exist any work more thoroughly dignified, more supremely noble than this very poem, this poem per se, this poem which is a poem and nothing more, this poem written solely for the poem's sake. Art for art's sake was a creed in the 19th century, Bohemia creed in the 19th century, a slogan raised in the defiance of those who, from John Ruskin to the much later humanist advocates of socialist realism thought that the value of art was to serve some moral or didactic purpose. Art for art's sake affirmed that art was valuable as art, that artistic pure pursuits were their own justification, and that art did not need moral justification, and indeed was allowed to be morally neutral or subversive. Literary language and literarians. One of the commonest question continually asked in literary criticism, literary theory, and in stylistics is what is literature? A related question equally proper as literary language: does it exist? What is meant by literature has since the 19th century very much involved imaginative, inventive, or fictional writing in the genres of prose, poetry, and drama. However, earlier sense of the word included other forms of learned composition and other culture disciplines such as philosophy and history. There is an inclusive sense currently in colloquial use today, namely when we talk of reading all the literature on cat breeding, skiing, holidays of air pollution, derived from lat litera. Latter literature has always been associated predominantly with the written medium. Although literature is in many societies orally composed and delivered, and such a body of composition existed in English society in the early days of the Anglo-Saxon settlements. One problem arising from the definition of literature as imaginative writing is that some works which are not imaginative have come to be classed as literary. The authorized version of Bible and Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This suggests either that literature characteristically has certain feature of form which distinguish it from other writing, or that it has a special effect on readers different from the response to other discourse, or both. Certainly it is often more memorable. Derek Atwright is probably right when he stresses the ability of readers to experience a literary text as begun fresh or differently many readings later or many centuries later. More generally, Ronald Carter and Peter Stockwell see the literary work as an actualization of the text as object, produced only by an observing consciousness. The literary work comes into existence only when we read. The question of literarians Roman Jacobson of literature has preoccupied many schools of thought. Literature is often discussed in terms of aesthetic value or effect. For instance, texts, especially poetic, which are admired for their formal beauty, arising from their structural coherence and pattering, or expressive and connotative qualities of meaning and their imagery. Certainly, literature, especially poetry, has commonly foregrounded language and meaning consciously and creatively in a way that overrides a simple informative function as the formalists and Prague school linguists stressed. It also leads to difficulties in translation, yet there are many literary works, especially prose, which employ no remarkably unusual or deviant language. Literature and humanism. Their language is literary not in a special sense, but only in the sense that it belongs to a work regarded as literature, as opposed to a newspaper or receipt. But part of literature's aesthetic value also comes from its effective appeal to the emotions of the reader and its ability to entrench in various ways, then literature is seen as an art form to be compared with music, painting. Yet it has to be admitted that aesthetic appeal is not wholly intrinsic but is based somewhat subjectively on what is regarded as beautiful by a culture or society in any given period. We should also note that some works of literature seems to be distinguished from others. Equally fictional in subjectively evaluative terms, we can talk of serious and popular literature. The novel of Thomas Hardy or Henry James, for instance, are more highly regarded in traditional literary criticism than the novel of Dick Francis or Barbara Cartland. Indeed, for many people, literature is only used as a term in this qualitative sense, and hence canons of major and minor authors are established. On the basis of the judged moral vision or universal appeal, however, evaluation is objective to the extent that it is usually based on the appraisal of features of form, of structure, and the familiar use of language as well as of the complexity, depth, and range of subject matter, characterization, and theme. Dear students, today I am not well, but I am trying my best to convey the things. If you are having after this lecture, if you are having any sort of any questions, kindly contact with me. Early stylistics of the 1960s followed those literary critics who stressed the autonomy of literature and concentrated attention on text whose language was stylistically marked in some ways. But under the influence of such disciplines as various as discourse analysis, Marxist criticism, and postmodernism, critical perspective shifted to the study of literature and its language in relation to other discourses, such as the media, in terms of a continuum rather than a polarity. Neither approaches cancels out the other. Literary language can be different and yet not different from ordinary or not non-literary language. There is, as it were, a prototype of literary language and also numerous variants, but it is the impossibility of the defining it in simple way then it is most defining feature. Dear students, as we are discussing introduction to the study of literature, so it's also the part of our aspect that Wallach and Warren on the concept of literature. Obviously, we are dealing with these two poets, so we will discuss the aspect discussed by Wallach and Warren on the concept of literature. One way is to define literature as everything in print. We then shall be able to study the medical profession in the 14th century or planetary motion in the early Middle Ages. A witchcraft in Old and New England, as Edwin Greenlaw has argued, nothing related to the history of civilization is beyond our province. We are not limited to Bell's letter or not to the printed or records in our effort to understand a period of civilization, and we must see our works in the light of its possible contributions to the history of culture. As earlier we have discussed the green laws theory and the practice of many scholars, literary study has thus become not merely closely related to this history of civilization but indeed identical with it. Such study is literary only in the sense that it is occupied with printed or written matter, necessarily the primary source of most history. It can, of course, be argued in defense of such a view that historians neglect these problems, that they are too much preoccupied with diplomatic, military, and economic history, and that thus the literary school is justified in invading and taking over a neighboring terrain. Doubtless nobody should be forbidden or to enter any area he likes, and doubtless there is much to said in favor and of cultivating the history of civilization in the broadest term. But still the study ceases to be literary. The objection that this is only a quibble about terminology is not convincing. The study of everything connected with the history of civilization does, as a matter of fact, crowd out strictly literary studies. All distinction fall criteria are not introduced into literature, and by consequences, literature will be judged valuable only so far as it yields result for this or that adjacent discipline. The identification of literature with the history of civilization as a denial of the specific field and the specific methods of literary study. Another way of defining literature is to limit it to great book which, whatever their subject, are notable for literary form or expression. Here the criterion is either aesthetic with alone or aesthetic worth in combination with general intellectual distinction. Within lyric poetry, drama, and fiction, the greatest works are selected on aesthetic grounds. Other books are picked for their reputation or intellectual eminence, together with the aesthetic value of a rather narrow kind. Style, composition, general force of presentation are the usual characteristics singled out. This is a common way of distinguish or speaking of literature. By saying that this is not literature, we express such a value judgment. We make the same kind of judgment when we speak of a book on history, philosophy, or science as belonging to literature. Most literary histories do include treatment of philosophers, historians, theologians, moralists, politicians, and even some scientists. It would, for example, be difficult to imagine a literary history of 18th century England without extended treatment of Berkeley and Hume, Bishop, Butler, and Gibbon, Burke, and even Adam Smith. The treatment of these authors, though usually much briefer than that of poets, playwrights, and novelists, is rarely limited to their strictly aesthetic merits. In practice, we get perfunctory and inexpert accounts of these authors in terms of their speciality. Quite rather cannot be judged except as a philosopher, Gibbon except as a historian, Bishop Butler as a Christian apologist and moralist, and Adam Smith as a moralist and economist. But in most literary histories, these thinkers are discussed in a fragmentary fashion without the proper context, the history of their subject of discourse, without a real grasp, that is, of the history of philosophy, of ethical theory, of historiography, of economic theory. The literary historian is not automatically transformed into a proper historian of these disciplines. He becomes simply a compiler, a self-conscious intruder. The study of isolated great books may be highly commendable for pedagogical purposes. We all must approve the idea that students and particularly beginning students should read great or least good books rather than complications or historical. We may, however, doubt that the principle is worth preserving in its purity for the science, history, or any other accumulative and progressing subject within the history of imaginative literature. Limitation to the great books makes incomprehensible the continuity of literary traditions, the development of literary genres, and indeed very nature of the literary process, beside obscuring the background of social, linguistics, ideological, and the other conditioning circumstances. In history, philosophy, and similar subjects, it actually introduces an excessively aesthetic point of view. There is obviously no other reason than stress on expository style and organization for singling out Thomas Huxley and all English scientists as the one worth reading. This criterion must, with very few expectation, favor popularizes over the great originators. It will and must prefer Huxley to Draven, Bergson to not. The term literature seems best if we limit it to the art of literature, that is, imaginative literature. There are certain difficulties with so implying the term, but in English, the possible alternatives such as fiction or poetry are either already permitted by narrow meanings or, like imaginative literature or Bell's letter, are clumsy and misleading. One of the objections to literature is its suggestion in the of limitation to written as printed literature. For clearly and coherent conception must include oral literature. The simplest way of solving the question is distinguish the particular use made of language and literature. Language is the material of literature, as stone or bronze is sculpture of paints and pictures, or sound of music. But one should realize that language is not mere inert matter like stone, but it is itself a creation of man and is thus charged with the cultural heritage of a linguistic group. That's all, dear students. Thank you. Inshallah, see you soon.